Welcome to the Waterloo podcast. My name is Martin Aaron. Since the year 2000, I've been building a database of the British Army at Waterloo. By compiling original records from the Public Record Office and Regimental Archives, I've gathered information about each of the 33,000 British combatants in 1815. This podcast series examines that data. Welcome to episode 27. This week we're looking at H Troop, or Ramsay's Troop of the Royal Horse Artillery. We'll begin, as always, by learning a little about the men of the troop, then look at their role in the battle, and then we'll finish by looking at what happened to the men in the years that followed. There were 5 combatant officers in the troop and 183 other ranks. These comprised the following, as you can see here: a staff sergeant, 3 sergeants, 3 corporals, 7 bombardiers, some artisan ranks, the smiths and so on, 1 trumpeter, 101 gunners, and 62 drivers, riding the horses that pulled the limbers, that pulled the guns and the ammunition wagons and so on. So let's find out about these men. Now, on the one hand, artillery records of this period are very dry. They give the bare facts with little or no what you might call human colour. Men are often simply listed as died. Now, they may have died of wounds in battle, died of illness, been hit by lightning, or any number of other extraordinary circumstances, but the clerks at Woolwich seldom reveal any such details. On the other hand, researching the artillery is a joy because there are so many surviving documents, and if you keep digging for long enough, it's possible to complete much of the jigsaw puzzle. I've recently been travelling around the country, taking long train journeys to various regimental archives, trying to locate any surviving description books for Waterloo regiments. And sadly, these recent trips have turned up nothing at all. I'd always been hopeful that a long-forgotten shelf in some dusty storeroom might still be home to these key ledgers for identifying the men in the ranks, largely forgotten by history. But alas, many seem to be lost. For the artillery, however, the Public Record Office at Kew holds many heavy folios which list every gunner, every driver, smith and farrier, and as we can see here, the data for Ramsay's troop is pretty close to complete. Where each man was born, his age, height, literacy, enlistment date, and what became of him, died or discharged. So let's begin with nationality. There's a record for all but 4 men of the 183, and we can see that there were 131 English, 37 Scottish and 11 Irish. Now, those 137 Englishmen came from a wide range of counties. There's a few from most regions around the country, but we can see the most common ones here. Kent, Norfolk, Suffolk and Shropshire all had 9 men, Nottinghamshire 11 men, Lincolnshire 12 men, but Lancashire a clear leader with 20 men, 11% of the troop. In terms of age, there's a birth year for 178 of the men. Gunner Jonathan Hudson from Sheffield was the oldest man in the troop, born in 1772, making him 43 in 1815. The youngest was driver Henry Booth from Spilsby in Lincolnshire, who was just 17. It's worth noting that of the 30 youngest men in the troop, 26 were drivers. Obviously, this was a less skilled role than the art of firing a cannon. The mean birth year is 1790, so aged 25 in 1815. Now, there's an enlistment date for 180 of the 183 men. The mean is just on the cusp of 1807-1808, so an average of 7 or 8 years' service. The 3 longest serving men in the troop were all Scotsmen from Berwickshire, Gunner James Dissington and George Hunter, and the longest serving of all was the troop's staff sergeant Samuel Coburn. These last 2 both from Duns, and enlisting within a few days of each other in early 1793. H Troop was formed in 1804, so almost a fifth of the men would have served in other artillery units prior to that, and many of these probably served in the Flanders campaigns of the 1790s. The troop was part of the disastrous Walcheren campaign of 1809, So around 2/3 of Ramsay's troop at Waterloo would have experienced that debacle. That, however, was its last trip overseas for 5 years, as it remained at home during the Peninsular War. However, transfers among units were common, and some men are likely to have served in other troops and seen action in Portugal, Spain and France. We know, for example, that Bombardier Samuel Hart was present at the battles of Vittoria, the Pyrenees, Orthez and Toulouse. It seems likely, too, that at least a detachment of the troop returned to Flanders in 1814 and took part in Sir Thomas Graham's campaign there, but this is hard to confirm. While the other ranks may have lacked combat experience, this was certainly not true of the troop's 5 combatant officers. You can see them here. Major William Norman Ramsay was the son of a Scottish Royal Navy captain. Aged 33 in 1815, he'd served in Holland in 1799, the Egypt campaign in 1801, and then in the Peninsula, serving in I Troop, Bull's Troop, and taking command when Major Robert Bull was wounded in 1812. Even in his lifetime, he seems to have been an almost legendary figure. The regimental history states,
"In Norman Ramsay were combined all the virtues which compel affection, and all the skill which demands respect. But there was more. He possessed that professional enthusiasm which hallows the dullest tasks and gilds the severest hardship. His pride in his troop made its men strive to be worthy of his good opinion. And it is in this way that a commander can with certainty generate esprit de corps among his men."
Sir Augustus Fraser, commander of the Royal Horse Artillery at Waterloo, wrote during the war,
"Ramsay is adored by his men. Kind, generous and manly, he is more than a friend to his soldiers."
So in episode 5 of this podcast, we heard how Ramsay had been second in command of Major Robert Bull's I Troop in the Peninsula, and it was in this capacity that the most famous event associated with Captain Ramsay took place, the dashing full gallop escape from nearly being surrounded and captured at the Battle of Fuentes do Nor in 1811. But as I say, this was actually with I Troop and not the men that Ramsay would command in 1815 at Waterloo. Ramsay's name was also well known for a far less glorious incident. 2 years later, when, during the pursuit of the French army after the Battle of Vittoria, Arthur Wellesley, not yet titled the Duke of Wellington, perceived Ramsay to have disobeyed a direct order and instructed that he should be placed under arrest. The hullabaloo was over Wellington claiming he had told Ramsay directly not to move his troop off from their quarters the following morning until he, Wellesley, sent word to do so. Ramsay, on the other hand, stated the Duke said no such thing, and that on being given orders by a staff officer to move off that morning, he had naturally done so. Despite 3 witnesses, an officer, a sergeant and a corporal, who were all present during Wellesley's initial conversation and who all backed up Ramsay's version of events, the poor captain remained under arrest. The whole affair seems to have been almost bizarrely petty of Wellesley, and the more that reasonable officers pointed out that Ramsay was innocent, the more irritated Wellesley became. It was 3 weeks before Wellesley, rather sulkily, finally agreed that Ramsay could return to the command of his troop. H Troop's second captain was Alexander MacDonald. He was the brother of Sir John MacDonald, Deputy Adjutant General. Alexander had served at the Cape of Good Hope in 1806 and then in South America in 1807, before serving throughout the peninsula, distinguishing himself at Busaco in 1810 and San Sebastian in 1813. The 3 lieutenants were William Brereton from Upcott House in Pilton, Devon, aged 26 in 1815, Phillips Sandilands, aged 25, from the village of Falkland in Fife, and Lieutenant William Robe, aged 24. As we've heard in previous episodes, the artillery was very much a family business, and Lieutenant Robe was the son of Colonel Sir William Robe, who had commanded the British artillery at the early peninsular battles of Roliça and Vimeira in Portugal in 1808. All 5 officers were extremely experienced battle-hard veterans. All had fought countless engagements in the peninsula, as well as other theatres of war around the world. Lieutenant Robe, for example, the most junior officer and youngest at 24 years old, had fought in 33 different actions prior to Waterloo. Let's now join H Troop in Flanders in 1815. As was standard, the troop was armed with 5 9-pounder guns and a single 5.5-inch howitzer. We can assume that each of the 3 lieutenants and the 3 sergeants were assigned to command 2 guns each. The troop did not arrive in time to take part in the Battle of Quatre Bras, but Lieutenant William Brereton was in action that day, having volunteered to act as an extra ADC to Major General Byng, commanding the 2nd Brigade of Foot Guards. In this role, he seems to have done rather well. Sir George Wood, commanding the artillery, later wrote,
"I have received from every commanding officer the handsomest testimony of the conduct of Lieutenant Brereton, both in the Peninsula and at the Battle of Waterloo, and I have it from General Byng to say that, on the Battle of the 16th, the horse artillery not being engaged on that day, he proffered his service to act as aide-de-camp, which service he performed to the great satisfaction of the General."
On the 17th of June, all the horse artillery troops joined the retreat towards the position at Waterloo. Pursued by French cavalry outside Genappe, the troop was forced to gallop across fields and up steep hills, which would have been a challenge for the teams of horses even in dry weather, but which now, in the torrential downpours of that afternoon, were testing in the extreme. By the time they arrived near La Belle Alliance, most horses had lost at least one shoe. The night of the 17th was thus a busy one for the farriers and smiths of each troop as they reshod hundreds of horses. In Ramsay's troop, these were farrier John Bruton and smiths Michael Fazakerley, Edward Vaughan and John Anderson. At Waterloo, the troop was positioned on the far right of the Allied artillery line. As the troop busied itself in preparation for the battle, the Duke of Wellington came by, riding along the Allied front line. The blot of the unfortunate affair after Vittoria still lingered. Understandably, Ramsay still felt the injustice to which he had been subjected. Lieutenant John Bloomfield, an artillery staff officer from Sligo, recalls,
"At Waterloo, on the morning of the battle, as the Duke rode along the line, he saw Ramsay at the head of his troop for the first time since his arrival in Flanders. He accosted him cheerfully as he passed. 'Morning, Ramsay!' Ramsay merely bowed his head sadly, until it nearly touched his horse's mane, but could not speak."
The troop was positioned in the front line from the start of the day. To its right was Major Bull's troop of howitzers, and Ramsay was able from his position to see the effective impact these shells had on carving lanes through a French column of infantry. To the left was Webber Smith's troop, also of horse artillery. All these troops were engaged throughout the day, and Ramsay's expended 660 rounds of ammunition. As we've heard previously, whenever the French cavalry approached, the gunners were expected to run for the shelter of the nearby Allied infantry squares. In the previous episode, we heard Captain Thackwell of the 15th Hussars describe an attack of the French cuirassiers and grenadiers à cheval, which sent the limbers and wagons of some Allied artillery hurtling back to safety. And I wonder if these might have been Ramsay's troop. It would seem to be around the right spot. Sir Augustus Fraser, commanding all the horse artillery at Waterloo, writes,
French cavalry did some of the boldest charges I ever saw. They sounded the whole extent of our line, which was thrown into squares. Never did cavalry behave so nobly, or was received by infantry so firmly. Our guns were taken and retaken repeatedly. They were in masses, especially the horse artillery, which I placed and manoeuvred as I chose.
The troop lost 4 of its 5 officers, the worst hit of any troop or battery of British artillery at Waterloo. Norman Ramsay was killed. Immediately after the battle, a devastated Sir Augustus Fraser wrote to his wife,
In a momentary lull in the fire, I buried my friend Ramsay, from whose body I took a portrait of his wife, which he always carried next to his heart. Not a man assisted at the funeral who did not shed tears. Hardly had I cut from his head the hair which I enclose, and laid his yet warm body in the grave, when our convulsive sobs were stifled by the necessity of returning to renew the struggle.
By the end of the battle, 1 gun had been disabled by enemy fire, 1 wagon destroyed, and Lieutenant Sandilands was in command, the only officer still standing. Late in the day, Bull's troop ran short of ammunition, and several men came over to lend assistance to Ramsay's troop. In addition, 2nd Captain Edmund Walcott from Webber Smith's troop to the left came over and took command of some of the guns of H Troop, so that by the end of the battle, the surviving 5 guns of H Troop were actually being manned by a Royal Horse Artillery hybrid of F, H and I troops. During the final French infantry attack, the troops' guns bombarded the French troops throughout their advance. Lieutenant Sandilands recalls,
"The fire of Major Ramsay's troop I caused to be directed against the enemy's attacking columns from the moment of their formation near La Belle Alliance until their arrival on the crest of our position near the Hay Sun. It then ceased, as the Duke of Wellington, who had brought up 3 infantry regiments from the right, deployed them on the flank of the French columns and shut them out from our view."
At the close of the battle, the troop remained in its position and did not join the advance, it being too exhausted and damaged. Immediately following the battle, Augustus Fraser compiled a roll of casualties in which he states Ramsay's troop lost 5 men killed, 9 wounded, and 12 horses killed. My figures are quite similar, 5 killed or died of wounds, but could only find 6 wounded. You can see these men here. As I've probably said several times in previous artillery episodes, I'll never cease to be baffled as to how artillery casualties in the other ranks can be so low. These are units which spent the whole day in the front line, yet have only a handful of casualties, 7% among the other ranks. And yet their officers suffered a devastating casualty rate of 80%. And with 660 rounds fired, the guns were clearly busy all day. It will always be a mystery to me. Perhaps it speaks of the marksmanship of the French skirmishers, able to pick off the mounted officers and not bothering with the rank and file. Who knows? According to Lieutenant Alexander MacDonald, young Lieutenant Robe received a bullet wound in the groin around 5 p.m. It was initially hoped that the wound was not too serious, but Robe died 24 hours later. Sir George Wood, commanding the artillery at Waterloo, was particularly impressed by the 2 wounded officers and mentioned them specifically in his dispatch following the battle.
"I shall certainly give in the name of Captain MacDonald for brevet promotion. It was with great difficulty that he could be made to quit the field when severely wounded, as well as Lieutenant Brereton, who remained in the field of battle until Lieutenant Colonel MacDonald ordered him to the rear to have his wounds dressed."
Sir Augustus Fraser found it difficult to cope with the loss of his friend Norman Ramsay. In a letter to his wife 2 days after the battle, he wrote,
"Now that the stern feelings of the day have given way to the return of better ones, I feel with the bitterness of anguish not to be described the loss of my dear friend Ramsay."
And then, in another letter, 2 weeks later,
"I cannot get Ramsay out of my head. Such generosity, such romantic self-devotion as his are not common."
The loss was particularly cruel for Norman Ramsay's family. His brother, Alexander Ramsay, had been killed at New Orleans in January 1815, and a 3rd son would die within a year. Following their wishes, Norman Ramsay's body was disinterred, Sergeant Livesey of Bull's troop being tasked with finding the original battlefield grave, and Ramsay's remains were returned to his native Scotland in August, where he was buried in the local graveyard at Inveresk. The troop remained in France as part of the Army of Occupation for over 3 years. Discipline was generally good, or perhaps the artillery had a more relaxed approach to punishment. Gunner Thomas Walker was nearly an exception. Court-martialed in January 1817 at Bailleul on the French-Belgian border for being in a state of intoxication when on duty, he was sentenced to 200 lashes, but forgiven for former good conduct. In November 1818, the troop finally returned to England, and a year later it was disbanded completely. Around a third of the men were discharged on this disbandment or shortly prior or after. The remainder were transferred to other troops which had survived the Army Reformers' guillotine. Men discharged in these broad reductions sometimes managed to re-enlist in other regiments. Driver James Patterson of this troop was one such man. Having been discharged in 1815, aged 32, he presumably got by on his artillery pension and Waterloo prize money for a while, but in 1818 re-enlisted, this time in the 40th Foot. It's noticeable how often Waterloo men would re-enlist into other Waterloo regiments, the 40th Somerset Foot being part of Lambert's brigade in 1815. Perhaps they still wanted to be among fellow veterans who'd shared the same glory. Anyway, poor James Patterson didn't last long as an infantryman. He was discharged again in 1821, this time due to deafness, which, his discharge papers suggest, was caused probably by his service in the artillery. 15 Waterloo men from H Troop served on in the artillery into the 1830s, and 2 men, both Scotsmen, were still serving in the 1840s, gunner Alexander Balfour from Pittenweem, Fife, and bombardier James Ledgerwood from Milrose, Roxburghshire. Lieutenant William Brereton recovered from his wound and rose steadily in rank, and as a Major General commanded the artillery in the First Opium War in China in the 1840s, and then in the Crimea in the 1850s. He rose further still to become a Colonel Commandant of the Royal Artillery. In his will, he left an interesting legacy, bestowing a fixed amount of money each year for the purpose of maintaining facilities, including the provision of equipment and refreshments for the game of cricket for the Royal Artillery rank and file who are stationed within the garrison at Woolwich. And Lieutenant Sandilands, the last officer standing at Waterloo, rose to similarly dizzy heights, ending his career as a Lieutenant General. Several of the other ranks lived into the 1850s and 1860s. At the unveiling of the statue of Wellington in Piccadilly, Manchester in 1856, Thomas Radford, a driver in H Troop from Pembury, Lancashire, and now aged 72, was reported by a newspaper to be among the Waterloo veterans in attendance. Probably the last Waterloo man standing from Ramsay's troop was gunner Richard King. Born in Kettleborough, Suffolk, he died at nearby Bredfield in 1878, aged 88. So that brings us to the end of this episode. As always, my sincere thanks to the excellent work of the kind volunteers who provided the readings for this episode. Some particularly superb performances this week, I think. If anybody else fancies reading a line or two to help out in these productions, do please get in touch. The email is waterloopodcast@outlook.com. I'm not quite sure yet which regiment will be next. There are a few options in the pipeline, so I'll leave you in suspense this time, but I do hope you'll join me again soon. Until then, many thanks for watching.
Morning, Ramsay!